I remember the exact moment when the exhaustion hit me like a wave I couldn't fight. It was late on a Thursday evening, the house silent except for the hum of my laptop and the distant ticking of the clock. I'd been working for hours, long past dinner, past bedtime, when I finally leaned back in my chair, eyes heavy and spirit worn thin. I thought, why is this so hard? Why does it always feel like I'm running faster but getting nowhere? Why, despite everything, do I never see the money reflect the sweat I pour in? It was a question with no easy answer, one that kept echoing in my mind like a refrain I couldn't shake. I wasn't alone in this struggle, though it often felt deeply personal. Around me, I saw friends, colleagues, even family members caught in the same relentless cycle. People working 2 jobs, skipping vacations, saying no to time with loved ones, all in the name of building a better financial future. Yet the frustration was the same. Effort didn't equal payoff. Dreams of financial security seemed to drift farther away instead of closer. It was as if there was an invisible force keeping us stuck, no matter how hard we pushed. In those moments of weariness, I started to notice something curious. The more I tried to grab opportunities, the more something inside hesitated. A mix of stubborn procrastination and creeping self-doubt that whispered, maybe it's safer to hold back. Maybe you're not ready. Maybe this isn't for you. I caught myself delaying decisions, avoiding tasks that could push me forward, and sabotaging chances without fully understanding why. Regret and confusion tangled with that fatigue, making the climb steeper. I began asking myself, what if the struggle wasn't about working harder, but about something far deeper? What if the invisible walls weren't crafted by external obstacles, but inside my own mind? After all, I was doing all the right things on the surface, putting in hours, cutting corners, sacrificing rest, but something fundamental was missing. It was like trying to write a story without understanding the language. Something powerful was happening beneath the surface of my thoughts and choices, shaping the way I responded to money and success without me even realizing it. This idea both shook me and gave me hope, because if the barriers were internal, then maybe they could be unraveled. If there was an unseen pattern steering my financial behavior, then shining light on it might be the key to unlocking change, real, sustainable change. I wanted to understand why my brain, this incredible organ designed to keep me safe, sometimes acted like it was holding me back from what I wanted most. What if my mind was wired to avoid risk in ways that actually cost me opportunities to thrive? Starting to explore these questions wasn't about blaming myself or feeling less capable. It was about gently exploring the ways my past, my fears, and habits were teaming up to keep me stuck, even when my intentions were the opposite. I realized I wasn't fighting against laziness or lack of talent. I was battling invisible emotional patterns, buried deep and rarely spoken about. Recognizing this was the first step toward stepping off that exhausting treadmill and finding a way forward that honored both my efforts and my well-being. I want to share with you this journey because it feels too common and too painful to stay hidden. Many of us carry the weight of this invisible struggle, tired of working beyond our limits, tired of sacrificing what matters most, tired of asking, why not me? Only to get answers that seem to lead nowhere. What follows is not a quick fix or a motivational pep talk. It's an invitation to see the story behind your financial fatigue clearly, without judgment, and with the possibility of transforming that weariness into freedom. It's a story about the powerful influence of our minds, how long-held unconscious habits shape the way money flows in and out of our lives, and how understanding this can open doorways to new, unexpected ways of reaching the security and abundance we crave. This is not about forcing ourselves harder. It's about learning what our minds truly need to feel safe enough to allow growth. As you read on, I invite you to walk with me through this discovery, starting with the subtle, often unseen emotional currents beneath our financial choices. We will explore how these patterns form, how they influence what we do and don't do, and how to gently, but powerfully, shift the narrative we tell ourselves. This is a shared journey of recognition, healing, and hope, because I believe that you, like me, are more than the exhaustion and frustrations of today. There's a new way waiting for us to find it, one where effort meets understanding, and where the financial future we deserve becomes possible. When I first started peeling back the layers of my relationship with money, I never anticipated how deeply embedded certain patterns were within me, patterns so subtle that I had mistaken them for mere habits or personality traits. It felt like discovering a secret map tucked away in an old book, revealing hidden paths that had quietly governed my every choice around earning and spending. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that these patterns were not random, but embedded scripts scripted long before I even fully grasped what money meant. One of the most striking revelations involved how early messages about worth and money intertwine in complicated, almost theatrical ways. For instance, I recalled a time in childhood when I heard my parents arguing about bills, voices rising, tension thick in the air. Their anxiety seeped into the atmosphere like fog settling in a valley. I didn't fully understand the specifics, but I absorbed the emotion. Money equals stress, conflict, and scarcity. It was as if my young brain prioritized emotional survival and silently decided that avoiding risks around money was the safest bet. This wasn't just a fleeting impression. It became a blueprint for how I unconsciously approached financial decisions decades later. What really opened my eyes, though, was realizing that these embedded scripts function as a kind of autopilot, where feelings of safety or threat trigger predetermined actions without deliberate awareness. One vivid example stands out. I received an invitation to invest in a promising project with a genuine chance to grow wealth over time. Oddly, my usual excitement was smothered by a creeping hesitation. The tightness in my chest felt like a silent alarm, yet I pushed it aside initially. In a private moment, I asked myself, why am I pulling back? The truth emerged. Beneath the excitement lurked an ingrained story that financial risk meant danger, and danger meant loss. It's fascinating to see how these narratives operate because they masquerade as common reasoning yet are deeply emotional. The brain's wiring doesn't just assess numbers. It processes the emotional context tied to those numbers. For me, this meant that even the prospect of expanding my income sparked a psychological defense, an instinct to retreat, because my inner landscape equated growth with vulnerability. I realized that beneath my actions wasn't just fear. It was a complex cocktail of subconscious memories and survival tactics repeated enough times to feel like my normal way of being. Another discovery that added depth was the interaction between identity and money management. Growing up, I absorbed subtle cues that hinted at who I was allowed to be in relation to money. Whether it quietly implied that good people avoid financial ambition or that confessing worries about money was taboo, these notions became invisible anchors weighing me down. There was a moment when I caught myself feeling a strange shame after talking openly about wanting more financial stability. That shame wasn't justified by my current situation, but seeded long ago, a lingering belief that desiring abundance meant being selfish or greedy. What made this even more intricate was how these mental routines influence behavior, like a puppeteer pulling strings from behind a curtain. I remember times when I set goals to improve my earnings, only to find myself procrastinating or doubting my ability to execute plans. It was as if an invisible saboteur was at work, constantly whispering that success would come with consequences I wasn't ready for. Maybe alienation, maybe loss of control. This narrative, vivid in its persistence, shaped countless decisions, pushing me toward comfort zones even when those zones no longer served my true ambitions. Navigating these internal dialogues required a deep dive into the mechanism itself, how thought patterns translate into action or inaction. In practice, I noticed skepticism about my money moves wasn't just rational caution, but a deeply emotional filter that evaluated potential outcomes through the lens of past wounds. That realization helped me differentiate between genuine risk assessment and patterns fueled by outdated fears. I began to see that breaking free involved rewiring this internal dialogue to challenge automatic responses that weren't aligned with present reality. Now, consider how this applies when you face an unexpected financial opportunity or hurdle. Have you ever felt a sudden freeze? Not because the option was bad, but because a shadow from your past quietly told you otherwise? This kind of internal resistance is less about the actual event and more about the emotional meaning attached to it. By recognizing this pattern in me, I learned to pause and ask myself, is this hesitation coming from true prudence or a protective mental habit rooted in history? One vivid technique I used was to imagine stepping outside my immediate feelings and observing them as if I were watching a film. Suddenly, the fear lost some of its grip. It wasn't an unstoppable force, but a conditioned response that could be acknowledged and redirected. This shift was like swapping a default map drawn in shadow for a new one illuminated by awareness. It allowed me to question ingrained messages with curiosity instead of submission, to test whether those old scripts served or hindered the growth I sought. This unfolding process wasn't neat or linear. It came with setbacks and resistance. At times, recognizing my own mental mechanism felt like facing a stubborn mirror reflecting parts one wished to hide. Yet with patience, I found that understanding the invisible reins pulling my financial decisions gave me a surprising degree of freedom. It was less about fighting or denying these inner narratives and more about gently rewriting them with intention and insight. The realization that our engraved money stories command so much more power than we often admit was deeply liberating. It illuminated why sheer willpower or extra hours spent hustling never smooth out all the bumps on the road. Instead, transformation demanded inviting those silent scripts into the light, understanding their origin, and consciously choosing new narratives that honor growth without sacrificing psychological safety. As I continued unfolding these patterns within myself, I uncovered new shades of how mental factors shape financial behavior, shades that extend beyond simple fear or motivation. Understanding this subtle psychological fabric offered a key to not only moving forward, but doing so with a sense of grace and genuine alignment. Each time I glimpsed these inner currents, I gained more clarity and confidence to sail through uncharted financial waters, armed not just with plans, but with renewed inner navigation. At a certain point, I found myself confronted with a peculiar paradox. Despite being driven and dedicated, I often dragged my feet when it came to actually managing money in ways that could generate lasting growth. It reminded me of a bird with clipped wings, yearning to soar yet tethered by invisible chains woven from my inner world. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, bills spread out before me like a landscape of obstacles, and suddenly noticed how deeply intertwined my self-worth was with each financial decision. It struck me that my relationship with money was not simply transactional, but profoundly emotional, reflecting an underlying dialogue between fear and hope that played out continuously within. Unexpectedly, anxiety about potential failure surfaced not only when I considered risk, but even when imagining success itself. Success felt like an unfamiliar terrain where I might not belong. I recalled a conversation with a mentor who gently asked, "What stories do you tell yourself about what you deserve?" That question lingered, pushing me to dig beneath excuses and surface doubts. I realized I carried a dormant narrative that personal achievement could provoke envy or isolation, a belief taught subtly through social cues linking humility with virtue and wealth with arrogance. This belief functioned as a subtle gatekeeper, discouraging me from pursuing opportunities fully or celebrating wins with confidence. The internal negotiations around money became a kind of tug-of-war. On one side, ambition urged me forward with bright visions of security and freedom. On the other, a whisper of apprehension cautioned restraint as a form of protection. I noticed this tension not only in my thoughts, but physically. Tightness in my chest before financial meetings, stomach churning when budgeting, a tendency to avoid reviewing numbers altogether. Money, I realized, was a barometer of control and vulnerability, tangled with old emotional wounds I hadn't addressed directly. In a moment of clarity during a solitary walk, I likened my experience to a garden overrun with weeds. Those weeds weren't visible at first glance, but beneath the soil lay roots choking potential growth. The intuitive effort to restore balance required learning to become a gardener of my own mind, patiently uncovering hidden beliefs and gently uprooting limiting stories without damaging the fertile ground beneath. This mental cultivation contrasted sharply with the frenetic pace of pushing harder externally. Instead, the focus shifted inward, nurturing a landscape where financial confidence could flourish naturally. Several months into this introspective work, an unusual pattern emerged that took me by surprise. Emotional triggers around money often masked as practical concerns. For instance, I avoided networking events that could expand my income not because of shyness alone, but because sharing financial ambitions made me uneasy. It dawned on me that exposing financial goals felt, paradoxically, like exposing fragile parts of myself vulnerable to judgment or rejection. Recognizing this helped shift my approach from stealthy caution to compassionate courage, turning social interactions into opportunities for mutual growth rather than threats to my sense of safety. Another surprising insight was that financial decisions weren't static, but shifting reflections of my emotional state. Times of stress amplified feelings of scarcity, narrowing my focus and hardening my grip on existing resources out of self-preservation. Meanwhile, moments of joy and connection brightened my outlook, inviting openness and experimentation with new financial possibilities. This ebb and flow illustrated a dynamic relationship where economic behavior danced with mood and mindset, encouraging me to cultivate emotional awareness as a foundational financial skill. One evening, confronted by the allure of a seemingly risky investment, I felt my inner dialogue unfold like a complex chess game. Each move, pros and cons, what-ifs and maybes, reflected not simply rational calculations, but an intricate negotiation with hopes, fears, and deeply held self-expectations. I paused and asked myself, is my hesitation guarding me or holding me hostage? This subtle distinction reframed the experience, allowing me to respond from a place of mindfulness instead of reactive fear. Instead of automatic retreat, I harnessed discernment, balancing caution with curiosity. Gradually, I grasped that escaping self-defeating cycles involved more than willpower. It demanded reorienting the lens through which I viewed money's role in my life. Money ceased to be solely a goal or problem. It transformed into a mirror reflecting my inner emotional landscape and an instrument sensitive to the quality of my internal relationship with worthiness and risk. This shift permitted me to interact with financial challenges not as adversaries, but as signals guiding self-growth, inviting me to refine strategies aligned with emotional truth. At times, this journey felt like navigating a labyrinth without a clear exit, each turn revealing new complexities and secret fears. Yet with persistence, moments of insight built bridges across seemingly insurmountable divides. The secret lay in developing a dialogue with myself that was honest yet kind, curious rather than condemning. In doing so, I began to loosen the grip of unconscious impulses and replace them with deliberate choices crafted from a coherent inner framework. This transformation was subtle but profound, paving a path toward practical shifts with lasting impact. Through this evolving inner work, my understanding of financial behavior moved beyond simple cause and effect. I experienced money as intertwined with identity, emotion, and the deep human desire for connection and security. Recognizing these layers empowered me to engage finances as a dynamic interplay of reason and feeling, courage and caution, creating space for new possibilities that honor both head and heart. This balance reframed my entire financial narrative, not just what I do with money, but who I am becoming through it. There was a moment when I realized my own mind was playing tricks on me, not out of malice, but as a survival tactic honed over years of unconscious programming. I remember sitting at my desk, a promising offer before me, a door to opportunity ajar, but instead of stepping through, I found myself paralyzed, caught in a web of invisible mental loops. It struck me that my hesitation wasn't laziness or fear in the way I usually imagined, but something more complex. A mechanism within me that equated stepping forward with stepping into danger. The mind was signaling stop, not because the path was treacherous, but because it wanted to keep me inside a safe, familiar perimeter. What surprised me was how this internal circuitry worked beneath the surface, translating emotions into protective reactions without my conscious consent. For instance, in the weeks following that moment, I noticed that when money entered my thoughts, I often experienced a visceral tightening in my chest, as if my body was guarding me from potential harm. This physical response wasn't random. It was linked to the stories I'd absorbed early on, whispering that financial risk was synonymous with loss and chaos. The fascinating part was that the brain, designed with the noble intent to shield me from harm, was inadvertently setting traps that kept me in place. This insight made me wonder about a particular conundrum I lived through. Despite understanding the value of investing, both emotionally and economically. I repeatedly found myself procrastinating on decisions that could lead to growth. It's as if my mind favored inertia. Interestingly, delving deeper revealed that my brain was deploying what I came to think of as emotion-coded roadblocks. Moments that should have sparked excitement, like planning for a raise or launching a side project, instead triggered a preemptive retreat masked by logical excuses. I caught myself saying things like, "I'll get to that later," or "maybe it's not the right time," though part of me was screaming for forward motion. One afternoon, while journaling in a quiet cafe, I scribbled down a question: what voices inside me resist change, and why do they have so much power? As I traced back, I uncovered that the voices were echoes of past disappointments, moments where attempts at growth met with setbacks, criticism, or outright rejection. These echoes had drilled into my psyche a subtle message that striving beyond my limits invited instability, or worse, failure. It dawned on me that these internal monologues, though faint, effectively guarded a fortress built around old fears rather than current realities. This revelation recast the way I interpreted self-sabotage. Instead of viewing it as a character flaw, it became an intricate dance between my desire for advancement and a deeply ingrained protocol aimed at self-protection. It reminded me of a sea turtle cautiously withdrawing into its shell when sensing danger, although the threat was merely a passing shadow. My mind's patterns were similarly defensive, well-intentioned but often misplaced. Later, during a particularly restless night, I visualized this process as standing at a crossroads, surrounded by thick fog. The maps I held were worn and smeared with time, suggesting directions I've been programmed to follow, but none seemed to lead me through the mist. I realized the maps represented inherited mental blueprints, rules about money and success that belonged to someone else's story, not mine. In recognizing their limitations, I felt a quiet determination to redraw the routes consciously, tracing new paths with clarity and intention. At work, I noticed my hesitation creeping back whenever a colleague shared business successes or ambitious goals. Instead of feeling inspired, I felt an unsettling pull into comparison and doubt. This emotional undercurrent stemmed less from envy and more from a hidden belief that I must downplay my own aspirations to avoid standing out or triggering conflict. This pattern illustrated how social dynamics could entangle with personal financial instincts, reinforcing caution and self-denial. On weekends, I entered deeply contemplative phases, tracking moments when my thoughts around money turned tense or constricted. One particular scene unfolded vividly. While reviewing potential freelance gigs, I felt a sudden urge to close my laptop and avoid the task entirely. The feeling wasn't about workload, but a protective reflex against change that required stepping into unknown territory. I pictured my brain as a security guard stationed at the gates of my comfort zone, waving off visitors who didn't match the familiar script written long ago. Yet, acknowledging this protector within shifted the dynamic altogether. Instead of rebelling against the resistance, I began to approach it with curiosity and kindness, asking, "What are you afraid will happen if we venture beyond?" This conversational internal stance gradually wore down the barriers, inviting dialogue where I once met silence or defiance. Through this lens, hesitation transformed from a dead end into a meaningful signal, an invitation to explore underlying beliefs and gently reshape them. In one such exploration, I reflected on how my past experiences with scarcity, abrupt change, and unpredictability had embedded a survival code equating financial safety with emotional shelter. This code dictated subtle behaviors, clutching tightly to the known, defaulting to cautious decisions, and avoiding risks even when logic signaled potential reward. Understanding that emotional imprints beneath my choices were rooted in survival rather than failure unlocked a compassionate perspective on my own limits and possibilities. As this awareness blossomed, I started experimenting with small, deliberate steps beyond my comfort zone, mindful of the mental signals arising along the way. Instead of rushing or ignoring discomfort, I engaged in a delicate negotiation between ambition and preservation. With each cautious stride forward, I reinforced an evolving story, one that honored my need for security while embracing the possibility of growth. This balance, I discovered, offered a more authentic and sustainable trajectory than the relentless push that once dominated my efforts. Through this process, I came to understand how deeply entwined emotion and cognition are in shaping our monetary choices. The intricate architecture inside my head, once a barrier, became a map for transformation when I learned to read its signs instead of resisting them. This ongoing dialogue between my inner guardian and my boldness continues to shape my journey, reminding me that true progress arises from harmonizing, not silencing, the voices within. I remember the day a subtle shift started unfolding within me, not dramatic or immediate, but like the first gentle breeze signaling a change in season. Sitting at my worn desk, I wrestled with a decision about reallocating some savings toward a small, unconventional venture. Logically, it made sense. Emotionally, an uneasy knot tightened in my gut. Yet instead of ignoring this sensation, I started paying close attention. What surprised me was discovering how often apprehension carried a whispering voice, not shouting warnings but murmuring doubts rooted in older experiences and perceptions I hadn't fully confronted. A particular memory surfaced, a conversation overheard years ago where a family friend hesitated to share investment advice, citing how fortune changes quickly. That comment had etched an invisible line in my mind, equating financial risk with instability and loss. Unlike loud fears, these low-level doubts were like a background hum, infiltrating decisions imperceptibly but steadily shaping my approach. Recognizing this was akin to tuning into a faint radio frequency, suddenly catching signals previously drowned by noise. This aware listening opened a new dimension, understanding the nuances in emotional cues influencing my actions. Seeking to unravel this further, I started journaling my spontaneous thoughts and feelings whenever opportunities appeared. Surprisingly, I saw patterns emerging, not just hesitations, but moments when I unconsciously minimized potential rewards or magnified hypothetical setbacks. It was as if my inner dialogue was playing a muted soundtrack marked by caution and restraint. On one particular day, after a productive workshop about entrepreneurship, I noticed my excitement didn't grow. Instead, it shrunk, replaced by a flicker of self-questioning. Is this really for people like me? This internal question wasn't about ability, but an ingrained sense of belonging, or lack thereof, in spaces associated with wealth creation. This realization became a gateway to re-examining the subtle role of identity in financial growth. Money wasn't just currency. It was a code tied to who I imagined myself to be. The more I explored, the clearer it became that the gap between my aspirations and actions was bridged by whether my self-image aligned with what financial success symbolized. In essence, taking steps toward abundance sometimes felt like stepping out of the story I had unconsciously authored about myself. Wrestling with this exposed a fragile thread connecting self-worth to financial possibilities, a delicate balance many of us unknowingly carry. In the midst of these revelations, an unexpected catalyst pushed me deeper into reflection. A chance encounter with a mentor who challenged my assumptions through a simple yet profound question. She asked, "What would shift if you saw money as a tool for your well-being instead of a measure of your value?" At first, I resisted this reframe, but gradually, it peeled back layers of judgment and tension associated with monetary discussions. Viewing finances from the perspective of care and nourishment rather than performance liberated me from binary thinking where I was either succeeding or failing. Instead, I was invited to nurture a relationship based on trust and compassion. This evolving perspective stirred new reactions. I noticed I stopped treating budget planning as a dreaded chore and began approaching it as a dialogue, listening attentively to where my resources could support the life I wanted rather than punishing myself for past choices. However, this wasn't a straight path. On tougher days, old scripts erupted, reminding me of invisible limits embedded in my subconscious. They surfaced as persistent inner voices suggesting caution should never abandon the helm. Faced with these moments, I learned to pause and kindly question whether these cautions were life-saving guidance or inherited anxieties no longer relevant. Another profound insight emerged when I realized how social narratives about money silently influenced my decisions. Stories we absorb, often unspoken, about who deserves prosperity or the right way to succeed subtly framed my ambitions. family gatherings, cultural attitudes, even media messages collectively painted pictures of financial achievement tangled with guilt or disapproval. Encountering this awareness felt like peeling away layers of fog, blurring my vision. Once I identified these external whispers embedded within, I could begin disentangling my unique hopes and values from collective expectations. This separation empowered me to claim space for a personal definition of success. Eventually, a pivotal moment came during a financial review session when I reframed mistakes not as failures, but as lessons, a shift that fundamentally altered my approach. Instead of avoiding numbers due to fear of judgment or disappointment, I embraced them as feedback, informing smarter choices with curiosity rather than blame. This practice cultivated resilience, allowing me to respond flexibly to setbacks instead of shutting down or retreating. The newfound agility in navigating financial uncertainties resembled learning to surf waves rather than fighting the ocean, a graceful coexistence with unpredictability. Looking back, I recognize these breakthroughs didn't arrive from a single epiphany, but a gradual intertwining of awareness, acceptance, and new interpretations. I shifted from wrestling with invisible limitations to partnering with them, honoring internal hesitations while gently guiding them toward expansion. It became clear that unlocking financial potential isn't always about removing fear outright, but learning to listen, interpret, and negotiate meaningfully with the emotions residing beneath. This evolving conversation transformed the currency between my intentions and outcomes into one marked by patience, authenticity, and increasingly nimble confidence. There was a time when I found myself standing at the edge of a promising offer, the kind that promised financial growth and stability, yet my body recoiled as if warning me of unseen dangers. I remember gripping the armrest of my chair, heart pounding unevenly, while a storm of conflicting thoughts swirled in my mind. Is this too risky? What if I fail? The internal conflict was overwhelming. But upon closer inspection, what baffled me most wasn't the fear itself. It was how swiftly my mind constructed elaborate narratives, convincing me to retreat, even before taking a meaningful step forward. The brains designed to protect me from harm morphed into a subtle jailer, constructing unseen barriers to opportunity. Digging beneath the surface, I perceived these mental walls as intricate mosaics, patchworks of past experiences, social conditioning, and deeply held beliefs colluding to keep me anchored. A vivid memory surfaced, sitting in a community gathering, listening as older relatives exchanged stories about financial loss and betrayal. Their voices carried a weight that seeped into the fibers of my psyche, embedding a silent caution that whispered, "Money is a source of discomfort and vulnerability." These ancestral echoes crafted an emotional backdrop influencing my impulses, nudging me away from bold moves I desired silently. However, this internal resistance was more than protective instinct. It was an ongoing negotiation between survival and aspiration. I recall evenings where ambition tugged me toward action, but indecision paralyzed my fingers hovering over a keyboard or my feet pacing in restless circles. A dialogue unfolded within me, unspoken yet intense, between hope and restraint. That tension shaped my behavior more profoundly than sheer fear, a nuanced struggle hidden beneath outward calm. One afternoon, a conversation with a close friend illuminated a new perspective. She asked, "What stories about money did you inherit without questioning?" Her words planted a seed further down the rabbit hole of my mind's finances. I realized many of my reactions weren't direct responses to present circumstances, but echoes of inherited beliefs playing on repeat. The realization sparked a pivotal insight. Emotional memory was the puppeteer pulling strings in my financial decisions. A script written long ago told me to avoid risk, equating financial growth with unpredictability and instability, even if reality had shifted. Progress came when I experimented with a simple but powerful technique. Instead of battling hesitation head-on, I visualized the feeling as a shadow lurking at the edge of a dimly lit room. Instead of flinching, I allowed myself to approach, letting the shadow reveal its contours without judgment. To my surprise, the threat diminished, revealing instead a collection of feelings: doubt, insecurity, fragmented hopes. This mental exercise helped me transform intangible fears into concrete sensations I could address thoughtfully, breaking their silent grip on my choices. Gradually, I noticed a new dynamic emerging in how I related to money. No longer was it a silent enemy to be feared, but an intricate companion reflecting inner struggles I was beginning to untangle. This shift was fragile, a dance between embracing vulnerability and summoning resolve. I started journaling moments of financial discomfort not as failures, but as invitations to dialogue with myself about unmet needs and unresolved emotions. This practice illuminated patterns previously invisible, fostering compassion in place of critique. A turning point occurred during a late night when I parsed through a decision about investing in a creative project. The old shadow of self-doubt lunged, conjuring images of loss and regret. Instead of backing down, I chose to respond aloud. What am I truly afraid of losing here? What part of me feels unsafe? Voice shaking but firm, I unpacked layers of uncertainty, revealing fears of judgment and inadequacy more than the money itself. This moment of self-confrontation felt like cracking open a sealed door, allowing bursts of light where rigid walls once confined me. I also found that dialogue with my body revealed truths intellect alone missed. Tightness in my chest, shallow breaths, a knot in my stomach. These signals became messengers, signaling when my mind's defenses flared. I learned to pause when the physical unease surfaced, creating space to honor feelings instead of dismissing them. This bodily awareness enriched my understanding of psychological boundaries so deeply embedded they often escaped conscious notice. Alongside these inner explorations, I began observing how cultural scripts writhed beneath social interactions. I saw how gatherings stirred unspoken rules around money, taboos against discussing wealth openly, subtle shaming tied to ambition, and grudging acceptance of financial success only if cloaked in humility. These unwritten codes shaped my financial self-expression, nudging me toward invisibility even when hunger for growth pulsed vividly within. A delicate balance emerged, managing external expectations while nurturing an inner truth yearning for freedom. Ultimately, this phase of introspection expanded my capacity to engage with financial opportunities less reactively and more thoughtfully. Instead of an automatic shutdown at the first sign of discomfort, I cultivated a patient curiosity, inviting my fears and dreams to coexist in the same space. A quiet revolution that reframed struggle into a fertile ground for transformation. It was no longer about conquering fear through sheer force, but learning to hold all parts of myself with grace, using awareness as a compass to navigate the complex terrain of money and meaning. The moment I agreed to take a leap into uncharted financial territory, a gnawing unease settled deep within my chest, unlike anything I had encountered before. It wasn't just anxiety. It was as if an internal compass was spinning wildly, unable to lock on a true north. That day, I recognized a previously unnoticed layer in how my psyche sabotages progress, a profound discomfort with financial ambiguity. Unpredictability wasn't just external. My mind rejected it internally, craving stability so fiercely that it unknowingly throttled my potential for growth. I remembered standing before an open ledger, lines of numbers blurring into a tableau of uncertainty. I had to decide whether to allocate a modest sum toward developing a personal project that thrilled me but promised no immediate payoff. My fingers hovered over the keys, the cursor blinking mockingly. Suddenly, vivid flashes of past unpredictability erupted, months during which unexpected bills wiped out savings, job changes that disrupted stability, times when I struggled to keep my footing. These memories ignited a silent plea within, avoid risk to avoid chaos. Yet, ironically, this mental signal often immobilized me before the first step, turning possibility into paralysis. As this inner conflict unfolded, I realized that my resistance wasn't merely fear of loss, but a discomfort with uncertainty itself. The human brain craves patterns and predictability. Uncertainty triggers an emotional emergency that overrides rational analysis. This insight led me to a revealing exercise. Whenever an unfamiliar financial choice presented itself, I paused deliberately and asked, what am I unwilling to tolerate in this unknown? The answer surprised me. It wasn't just, I'm scared of losing money, but I can't handle feeling exposed, or I'm afraid of how others will judge my unpredictability. These new revelations highlighted the complex emotional choreography behind what seems like simple hesitation. One afternoon, my best friend Maya and I sat on a park bench, discussing my growing awareness of this internal machinery. She shared her experience with embracing risk differently, describing it as learning to dance in the rain instead of waiting for the storm to pass. Her words struck a chord. I imagined my discomfort as heavy boots weighted by past storms, weighed down by expectations of control. The metaphor inspired me to experiment with lighter footsteps, small, low-stakes financial choices designed to cultivate comfort with ambiguity. With nervous anticipation, I dipped my toes into freelance gigs that paid less, but offered creative freedom, navigated investment decisions that involved moderate uncertainty, and gradually redefined my definition of stability. Interestingly, these initial steps revealed another hidden layer: my tendency to overvalue control and equate flexibility with irresponsibility. When a deadline shifted or a financial plan needed revising, an inner critic welling up accused me of incompetence. This harsh self-dialogue made adaptability more of a feared admission of failure than an asset. Recognizing this, I began journaling conversations with that critic, challenging its rigid standards, and reflecting on times when flexibility had saved me from greater pitfalls. I realized my brain was conditioned to see steadiness as strength, while unpredictability registered as weakness, an outdated framework that clashed with today's dynamic economic landscape. Trying something radically new, I imagined my financial journey as a sailboat navigating a sea without a fixed course. Steering required ongoing adjustments, gusts of wind often unpredictable, and smooth sailing was not guaranteed. Holding tight to old notions of steadfast certainty only ripped away the sails. This imagery inspired me to rewrite my inner script, to view uncertainty not as an enemy, but as an inevitable and even valuable part of progress. This shift made room for instinct and creativity alongside logic, forming a richer, more resilient landscape within my mind. The release wasn't instantaneous. At one point, I received an offer to invest in a local startup, an exciting prospect but fraught with unknowns. My instincts screamed to decline for lack of guarantees, yet the newfound dialogue encouraged me to pause and inquire gently. What am I truly protecting, and what am I potentially missing? Picturing the water beneath my sailboat helped me decide I was willing to weather some instability in exchange for growth. The investment wasn't without bumps, but the act of choosing courage over confinement sparked a wave of empowerment I hadn't anticipated. Throughout this process, I uncovered the central truth that complexity and ambiguity are fundamental to financial evolution. Seeking certainty in a fluid world sets up traps that slow progress and drain energy. Embracing uncertainty shifts perspective from rigid rules to adaptive wisdom, offering a balance between caution and curiosity. It invites a heartfelt partnership between mind and emotion, one where discomfort signals a threshold to cross instead of a stop sign. You might recognize this tug yourself, that instinct to clutch tightly to familiar frameworks while a restless part of you yearns to explore new possibilities. By naming the unease surrounding unpredictability and learning to navigate through it with intention, we open doors previously locked by invisible chains. This journey demands patience and bravery, for it asks us to meet the unknown delicately, not with aggression but with a curious, steady heart. Such is the delicate art of building not just financial gains, but deep-seated resilience. One night, I found myself alone in my dimly lit apartment, staring at a spreadsheet that detailed my monthly expenses and income streams. The numbers didn't scare me. They simply seemed disconnected from my reality. I realized that, despite the data in front of me, my decisions were being influenced by an invisible sense that financial success was not truly attainable on my terms. It was like an unseen script was running silently in the background, whispering limitations I hadn't consciously acknowledged. The pressure to keep moving forward physically clashed with this quiet withdrawal within, creating a tired tension in my chest. I started to think of my mental patterns as a kind of operating system, one quietly running outdated software that no longer served the business I wanted to build or the life I hoped to live. Overly cautious antivirus programs were scanning for dangers and shutting down opportunities automatically, even when the threats were minimal or imagined. I realized my brain prioritized preserving the familiar environment at the expense of cultivating the unfamiliar rewards that come from calculated risks. Walking through a park the next day, I saw a squirrel dart quickly, then freeze, ears twitching at every sound. The creature's survival instincts mirrored my own, overly tuned to detect threat in harmless stimuli. While the squirrel's behavior kept it alive, for me, these instincts were keeping my full potential locked away. Observing this made me painfully aware that my body and mind had been conditioned to respond reflexively, to protect against disappointment or failure, but at great cost to opportunity and growth. When I tried to push past these instincts without understanding them, I often exhausted myself, as if swimming upstream in a swift river. Instead, I began experimenting with a gentler approach, allowing myself to notice these freeze moments without rage or frustration. Not beating myself up softened the grip those reflexes had on me, creating tiny pockets of space where new behaviors could sneak in. In one such moment, instead of ignoring a cold call from a potential client that triggered doubts, I sat quietly and explicitly thanked the hesitation, acknowledging it was there to protect me, then invited curiosity to take its place. To deepen this exploration, I connected with an old friend who had built a thriving creative business despite setbacks and doubts. His stories were full of unexpected detours and early failures, but also room for growth nurtured by embracing uncertainty. He described how shifting his internal dialogue from, "I don't know if I'm ready," to, "I'm learning how to navigate the unknown," reshaped his approach to opportunities. Hearing this, I felt a seed planted, a hopeful possibility that my reactions weren't fixed, that my nervousness could evolve into informed caution coupled with courage. One rainy afternoon, I sat by a window watching droplets race down the glass. Each droplet moved unpredictably, sometimes merging, sometimes diverging, a dance of fluid movement shaped by gravity and resistance. I drew a parallel between those droplets and my path with finances. Unpredictable, yet graceful, if I allowed them to flow without rigid control. This metaphor helped me consciously loosen my grip on certainty, inviting myself into the fluidity instead of resisting it. It also allowed space for experiments without fear of unexpected results. As I engaged in this inner dialogue, I noticed that financial choices often evoked a tug-of-war between vigilance and exploration. One Saturday morning, as I prepared to send a proposal for a freelance project, an urgent voice inside cautioned me to hold back, predicting outcomes that might lead to rejection or wasted effort. Instead of succumbing, I slowed down, breathing deeply, and framed the situation as an invitation to grow my resilience. I told myself, I can learn from whatever happens, and my worth isn't bound to this one response. That shift in mindset, small though it seemed, changed my relationship to challenge, transforming hesitation into action. Another turning point came when I took a meditative approach to my feelings about money. I closed my eyes and visualized my relationship as a flowing river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent. I imagined dips and swells of emotion as natural features of the riverbed, not problems to be fixed, but parts of a larger ecosystem. This exercise offered a fresh perspective, reminding me that striving for constant control was unrealistic. Instead, I could cultivate awareness, steering my vessel through currents with patience and skill, fostering an inner stability amidst external unpredictability. Conversations with others revealed shared patterns. Many people I met were silently burdened by the weight of expectations and past shoulds placed on finances, limiting their freedom. Hearing these stories encouraged me to think about how liberating it could be to rewrite those inherited rules. What would happen if I granted myself permission to create new definitions of success, ones informed by my values rather than inherited fears? This question opened new doors, demanding a willingness to explore vulnerability and authenticity within personal finance. Through the interplay of these experiences, I sensed a profound shift. It wasn't about vanquishing fear or eliminating discomfort entirely, but about embracing complexity and ambiguity as inevitable parts of growth. By befriending rather than battling these sensations, I allowed my financial journey to unfold with a richer texture, one woven with threads of self-compassion, flexibility, and resilience that nurtured sustainable progress. This process felt like learning a new language spoken by both heart and mind, inviting me to speak fluently in a dialect that honors both courage and caution. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing at a crossroads illuminated not by the harsh glare of certainty, but by the gentle glow of emerging insight. It's as if layers of mist that once obscured the terrain have begun to lift, revealing contours and pathways I couldn't perceive before. The terrain is neither flat nor easy. It ripples with shadows and light, inviting us to navigate with a new kind of attentiveness, one that honors the intricate dance between caution and courage, fear and hope. I recall moments when a whisper inside me urged retreat, a subtle tightening that constricted the expansive vision I so fervently longed to embrace. Yet those same moments contained a paradoxical invitation, a beckoning to engage in dialogue with my hesitation rather than dismiss it as weakness or failure. It's curious how the mind's protective impulses, initially experienced as barriers, can become doorways if we listen with compassion and curiosity. This transformation requires patience and a willingness to linger with discomfort until it reveals its hidden message. In those spaces between certainty and doubt, I have come to perceive a richer texture, woven from threads of old stories, silent agreements, and unspoken fears that shape the rhythms of our financial lives more than we often acknowledge. Like an intricate tapestry, these threads intertwine, creating patterns that at first seem immovable, yet, with gentle unraveling, offer opportunity for fresh design. There's power in simply becoming aware of the loom on which these stories are woven, as it grants us the choice to reweave our relationship with abundance on new terms. What resonates deeply is the recognition that growth is seldom a straight line. Instead, it resembles a river's meandering path, carving its course amidst rocks and bends, sometimes slow and reflective, other times rushing forward with unstoppable energy. Our inner landscape mirrors this fluidity. Now and then, resistance rises like a current pulling against the flow, urging us to halt, reconsider, and sometimes retreat. But within every pause lies a subtle invitation to observe, to understand the water's temperament, and to align with it rather than fight it. I sense a quiet revolution stirring beneath the surface, a shift from striving with relentless force to moving with mindful intention. The experience has taught me that it is in the coexistence of opposites, security alongside adventure, stability intertwined with flexibility, that resilience blooms. This delicate harmony, though elusive, beckons us to rethink what it means to truly thrive. Financial resilience is not built solely on plans and spreadsheets, but carved out in the spaces where emotion, belief, and action meet. As I navigate this evolving terrain, I feel the contours of a new narrative taking shape, one that refuses rigid dichotomies of success and failure. It embraces the ambiguity that life offers without shrinking back, treating uncertainty not as a threat, but as an integral companion on the journey. This new narrative doesn't demand relentless pushing, but invites a dance, sometimes forward, sometimes still, sometimes sideways, that honors our whole humanity. I invite you to imagine with me what it would mean to inhabit such a story, to hear the whispers of hesitation with empathy, to recognize their role without surrendering to them, and to discover within this tension a powerful source of wisdom. The journey into this space is not always comfortable. It asks for courage of a different kind, not the daring leaps fueled by adrenaline alone, but the steadfast commitment to presence and self-compassion. In this luminous yet shadowed terrain, I've learned to meet my fears not as enemies, but as guides, offering clues about where healing and growth entwine. It is here, in these complex conversations with ourselves, that transformation begins, not through sheer will, but through understanding the dance of our desires and defenses. As we move forward, this unfolding awareness promises to inform choices with depth and nuance, allowing us to step into possibility with a steadier heart. So here we are, poised on the edge of something both ancient and new, a space charged with potential and inviting us to sync with a rhythm that respects both our longing for security and our hunger for freedom. The moment is ripe, the horizon wide, and the path beckoning us onward. Together, with gentleness and resolve, we prepare to step into what comes next. I recall a quiet evening, the kind when the world outside dims just enough for the mind to grow loud. I sat alone, the weight of years spent chasing financial goals settling unevenly across my shoulders. It was not frustration alone, but a deeper ache, a complex tangle of hope, fear, and exhaustion. In that stillness, a question emerged not from my lips, but from the space inside me. What if my struggle wasn't due to lack of effort or willpower, but something far more elusive, woven into the fabric of my very identity? As days unfolded, I began to realize how my mind, protective and wary, had been holding me in patterns that whispered caution louder than encouragement. This internal dialogue, so familiar yet so quietly relentless, had become a silent gatekeeper, shaping not only my choices but the emotional landscape through which I perceive possibility. The irony settled on me with gentle insistence. My most significant barrier was not in the world outside, but in the subtle architecture of my beliefs and feelings intertwined with value and security. I remembered conversations with others walking similar paths, people bound by invisible threads of inherited ideas, fears disguised as prudence, and hesitations clothed in logic. Collectively, we carried stories of restraint, often unaware how deeply they were etched inside us. The challenge, then, was to listen closely to those muted stories, to invite them into the light without blame, and to engage them as guides toward transformation instead of enemies to defeat. There was a moment, vivid now, when I stood before a fork in the road. One path promised the comfort of predictability, the known rhythm of steady toil and cautious choices. The other beckoned with uncertainty, risk, and the allure of growth beyond current limits. It wasn't the fear of failure alone that caused hesitation, but the dizzying potential of change itself. To move forward meant stepping into a wilderness of emotions, navigating shadows that had long influenced my smallest decisions. In a handful of quiet conversations with myself, I discovered that these emotional undercurrents were messengers, conveying important truths about what safety meant to me. These realizations reframed hesitation from resistance into a complex invitation to tend to my inner landscape with patience and grace, to build bridges between restless ambition and cautious self-care. It became clear that the path forward required an embrace of vulnerability, not as weakness, but as fertile ground for authentic growth. There was a night when I found myself speaking softly to the fears that surfaced with each financial choice, no longer silencing them, but thanking them for their vigilance while gently asking them to relax their hold. This delicate dialogue unveiled a new rhythm, one where courage did not roar but whispered, steady and unyielding, encouraging me to walk steadily despite trembling knees. The transformation was neither swift nor absolute, but a gradual unfolding that allowed space for both strength and fragility. Alongside this inner work, I observed how cultural expectations and silent norms had shaped the way I envisioned my journey toward abundance. Once unseen chains linking success to worthiness loosened their grip, I was free to paint a vision of prosperity that honored my values and capacities. This freedom nurtured not only a new financial mindset, but a renewed relationship with myself, one grounded in compassion and realignment rather than rigid ideals. In the quiet corners of my mind, I began to reimagine the very meaning of wealth, not as an endpoint or a golden reward, but as a living expression of freedom, balance, and wholeness. Money became, instead, a reflection of the inner resources I cultivated: resilience, clarity, and a willingness to engage with discomfort without surrender. This subtle but profound shift transformed the stakes from external measures to an internal dance, a weaving of intention, feeling, and deliberate action. Now, as I look forward, I carry with me the awareness that true transformation emerges not from fighting against the tides, but from learning their language, listening deeply, trusting the process, and moving with curiosity. I encourage myself and others to approach financial growth as a journey marked by tenderness and resolve, where every hesitation is a teacher, every setback is a doorway, and every small step illuminates the path ahead. In this ongoing story, We are not alone in our struggles, nor are we defined by them. Instead, we are authors with the power to rewrite the narrative, crafting a future where abundance flows not as a distant mirage, but as a natural extension of our awakened being.